Good morning and welcome. My name is Andrew Wilder. I'm the Vice President of the Asia Center here at USIP. For those of you not familiar with the United States Institute of Peace, we're celebrating our 40th anniversary year here. We were founded in 1984 by U.S. Congress to be an independent, nonpartisan public institution with a mission to prevent, mitigate, and resolve violent conflict. We're delighted you could all join us today for the launch of the USIP's Senior Study Group report on counterterrorism in Afghanistan and Pakistan. In 2022, USIP convened a bipartisan group of experts with a range of policy, scholarly, operational, and analytical experience on counterterrorism as well as South Asia policy. In meetings from 2022 to 2023, the Senior Study Group analyzed ongoing terrorism threats from Afghanistan and Pakistan and identified policy options for a sustainable counterterrorism policy in the region that is compatible with U.S. strategic competition priorities. Today, we're delighted to have the co-chairs of the study group, Lieutenant General Mike Nagata and Laurel Miller, with us. We thank them for their leadership of this group, and I also wanted to recognize the other members of the group, some of whom are with us today. That's Dr. Tricia Bacon, Shamila Chowdhury, Dr. Brian Finucane, Major General Robin Fontes, Larry Henderson, Dr. Colin Jackson, Dr. Carter Malkasian, Ambassador Mike McKinley, Ambassador Ann Patterson, Dr. Andrew Radin, Andrew Watkins, Dr. Joshua White, Scott Warden, Catherine Zimmerman, Tamanna Salikuddin, and Asfandiar Mir. And again, a big thank you to all of you who put a lot of time and effort into this report. We'll now have a discussion on the report and its key conclusions with the study group co-chairs, Mike Nagata and Laurel Miller, as well as study group member Asfandiar Mir, who's a director of the effort, as well as the executive director of the study group report, Tamanna Salikuddin, who will moderate the discussion. And just a bit on their backgrounds, Lieutenant General Mike Nagata retired from the U.S. Army in 2019 after 30 years of active duty with 34 years in U.S. Special Operations. A decorated officer, he served in important counterterrorism roles over the last 2 decades, including as the Director of Strategic Operational Planning for the National Counterterrorism Center from 2016 to 2019, and Commander of U.S. Special Operations Command Central from 2013 to 2015. He also deployed to Pakistan as the Deputy Chief Office of the Defense Representative at the U.S. Embassy, and much more. Laurel Miller is the president of the Asia Foundation, and prior to that was the director of the Asia program for the International Crisis Group. Earlier, she served in several positions in the U.S. government, including as the State Department Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan, and as a senior advisor to the Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs. And then much more importantly, prior to that, she was here at USIP as a senior expert. Dr. Asfandiar Mir is a senior expert with USIP's South Asia program, where he focuses on South Asia security issues. Previously, he taught in the political science department and held positions at the Center for International Security and Cooperation at Stanford University. Asfandiar received his doctorate in political science from the University of Chicago. And last but not least, our moderator today, Tamanna Salikuddin. Tamanna is the director of South Asia programs at USIP. She joined USIP after 12 years in the U.S. government, focused on South Asia and conflict resolution. From 2014 to 2017, she was a senior advisor to the Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan at the U.S. Department of State. So with that, I will now invite our panelists up to the table and turn over to Tamanna for you to moderate today's discussion. And again, thank you all for coming and joining us today.
Thank you all so much for joining us here today, both our online audience and all of you here in person. It was a real pleasure to work with this team and the entire study group over the last 2 years, really deeply thinking about both the lessons learned over 20 years of US presence in the region, but also as we're going forward, what are the options for the future and what should we be focused on? So in the conversation today, we really want to touch on 4 buckets of analysis that the group thought about very deeply in our meetings. One, we want to think about the strategic logic of counterterrorism, both in the past but going forward. We want to think about what are the terror threats that endure and are rising from the region as things continue to evolve without a US presence in the region. And then policy options identified and recommended by the group, and I think most importantly, the question of how to deal with the worst case scenario of a major terrorist attack. So I'm going to ask our panelists some questions. And first, I've worked with all of you in different capacities throughout our careers. And over the last 20 years, post 9/11, really, we had a pendulum swing towards counterterrorism. And we could say after the US withdrawal from Afghanistan, that pendulum has swung back. In the final report, it notes, following 9/11, the national security policy pendulum swung to an overwhelming focus on counterterrorism. But since the US withdrawal from Afghanistan, it appears to have swung in the opposite direction. And so I want to start with you, Laurel. Why in the world should we be swinging back? Are we going all the way back to that counterterrorism focus? How do you see the strategic logic of thinking about this issue today?
Well, first of all, I don't think anyone on the study group or on the stage here today is recommending that we go back to that overwhelming focus on counterterrorism. That's not what our analysis was as to what the needs are, and it's certainly not anything that would be plausibly realistic in policy terms. I think our bottom line observation was that that the U.S. has gone too far in averting its gaze from some still difficult and challenging issues. And we further observed that that some of the reasons for that swing of the pendulum away from any kind of focus, really hardly at all, on, nobody talks about counterterrorism in Washington anymore. This is an unusual event in that the words counterterrorism or Afghanistan or Pakistan are on the stage. Any of those 3 terms you just don't see or hear around Washington anymore. It's kind of a barometer in a room like this and an event like this of where the conversation is and where the policy focus is in Washington. The reasons for that swing away, some of them are perfectly logical. Other priorities, other pressing priorities. A long time ago, one of the first times I was working in the US government, a very senior, experienced person who'd been around Washington a long time told me, Washington the senior levels can only deal with 3 things at a time. Yes, it's a giant government with an enormous bureaucracy, but really when it comes down to it, decision makers can only focus on 3 things at a time. Well, we've today got China, Russian invasion of Ukraine, and Gaza. Before Gaza, there was the focus on the India relationship, a lot of priorities that really squeeze this out of the agenda for some, from an American perspective, perfectly logical reasons. But I don't think we can ignore the human dimension of policymaking. There's just fatigue with talking about, thinking about, putting resources towards counterterrorism in Afghanistan. And I think the fatigue was exacerbated by putting too much into this, too overwhelming and obsessive a focus, so that in the early days after 9/11, you would hear people say that to get any resources for anything that you wanted to do, whether it was really related to counterterrorism or not, counterterrorism had to be in your budget justification somehow. Fast forward, China's got to be in your budget justification somehow. And there's a kind of bureaucratic imperative that follows on from that shift of policy focus, shift of political focus And in this particular case, the fatigue, and the fatigue with Afghanistan in particular was a slow burn. I mean, there were many senior people in decision-making positions in Washington that wanted to be done with Afghanistan sooner than it was. But then once the opportunity, if you want to put it that way, arose to just be completely done with it, that's where, you know, the hearts and minds in Washington turned.
Well, thank you for that, Laurel. Mike, I want to turn to you. I mean, Laurel mentioned this idea of fatigue, and I know the group talked a little bit about the role of trauma in the last 20 years as potentially a barrier to good policymaking. I know everyone thinks policymakers are non-emotional, but I want to touch, at USIP, we can touch on the emotions. So, you know, both decision makers and many who labored within the national security agencies show signs of something like collective trauma resulting from the last 20 years. And that trauma permeates multiple levels of the national security bureaucracy and often affects assessments of the threat landscape and how it can affect national security interests. So the tragic end of US involvement in Afghanistan has also made it quite a toxic issue, regardless of which side of the political aisle you stand on. So it's rare to find a senior group of national security professionals focusing on this challenge to policy. Can you spell out why you and others in the group maybe saw this, you know, our experience and our 20 years of emotion and intense focus as a barrier to policymaking on this?
Thank you. It's a great question. It's a topic that is still very much on my mind, and I'm personally delighted that the study group spent a fair amount of time on this particular topic, because I don't think it's gotten enough attention, even to this day. There is a lot of trauma, particularly in the what we inartfully style the CT community, but it is of varied types, and it's not distributed evenly. Rather predictably, the most obvious, and in some ways the saddest form of trauma is the physical, psychological, emotional trauma that counterterrorism practitioners, whether military or civilian, that's in some cases spent years in South Asia, are still grappling with to this very day. I'm sure everyone in this audience knows that after the sudden withdrawal of US forces a couple of years ago now, there was a spike in veteran suicides, and a very large number of those suicides were Afghanistan veterans. But while this has tended to be the most attention-grabbing form of trauma, there are other forms as well. And I'm going to talk about a couple of things here. Trauma may not actually be the best word to use, but I'm going to use it anyways because I think it all flows from the same source. And that is the disappointment, the frustration, the unhappiness, and in some cases the tragedies that flowed from our time in South Asia. At more senior levels, where rather predictably, once you get to be a flag officer or an SES, the likelihood you're going to get shot in an ambush or blown up by an ID goes down considerably. It's not impossible, but it goes down significantly. So you're less likely to have experienced some of the physical trauma that, for example, the average infantryman or the average special forces team might have experienced in constant combat. But the trauma, the disappointment, the frustration that comes from one of several sources. I'm just going to list a couple. One is not receiving either the information or the authority or the resources that you believed were necessary to ensure success, or at least reduce the likelihood of failure. Now, nothing in life is perfect. You're never going to get everything you ask for, but there were too many cases, there were too many places where there was a clear operational need, and it wasn't just military needs, it was development needs, it was all kinds of needs, but help was not forthcoming either fast enough or in sufficient volume. And so very important objectives went glimmering. That can be a source of trauma, particularly if you have promised someone that you're going to help them with something, you're going to solve some sort of problem, and you end up having to go back on your word. And then, of course, there's frustration. The frustration of dealing with such a complex, dangerous, constantly changing environment. And there's very little, as I look back on my own career, there was very little in my own military education that prepared me for the amount of frustration that I would have to deal with. And I was a senior officer. If you go down several levels below where I was at that point, the frustration was just seething in various parts of the U.S. effort. Not just the U.S. effort, the coalition effort. Anyways, try to wrap this all up. That trauma, that frustration, that emotional turmoil had real consequences operationally. I saw people just give up hope. I saw people literally quit. They didn't go home, but they stopped working because they kind of internally, they'd thrown their hands up, said, what's the use? And some of this is inevitable. Large-scale campaigns, large-scale operations, protracted investments like we made in Afghanistan, there's going to be a certain amount of this. But I would argue an accurate read of our history there, we did this too often to ourselves.
Thank you for that. I think we have to keep that in mind as we think about how we deal with this issue as we go forward. I want to turn to Esfandyar. The study group asks us to refocus on counterterrorism and think about the evolving threats in a new way. What would you say to perhaps people who disagree and call counterterrorism a distraction, and that strategic priorities have shifted? Laurel mentions China. Obviously, global competition, China, Russia are top of mind of many policymakers. But also just in terms of regional focus, this is talking about Afghanistan and Pakistan, two countries that really aren't at the top of policymaker lists. So how do we balance all of that and keep our eye on important pacing strategies and pacing concerns that we have, threats around the world, and at the same time, pay attention to these terrorism threats?
Right. Thank you for that question, Tamanna. I think the most obvious and important imperative of continued focus remains saving lives. This was certainly the imperative that motivated the US campaign over the last 20 years. And I think the group agrees that this imperative very much remains in play because a worrisome sort of dimension of the terror threat from this region is that it continues to be focused against the United States, US interests, US persons, American citizens. Terror groups in this part of the world definitely want to harm Americans. And so we must do what we can to prevent any loss of life. I think that is the foremost imperative, a strategic imperative as well. But there's certainly more. Conventional wisdom in Washington now is that counterterrorism is a distraction from a strategic competition, and people point to loss of resources from strategic imperatives against China, Russia, loss of leadership attention certainly took people away from those issues over the last 20 years. Our group saw it differently. I think we spent time thinking about what would happen to strategic competition priorities if there were major mass casualty terror attacks. So consider the most recent attack in Moscow, Russia. What if that had taken place in a part of Western Europe or against a US interest overseas? Worst case, in the US homeland. I think that would exert immense pressure on policymakers, political leaders to react assertively. We're seeing a variant of that situation in the Middle East. I mean, since the October 7th attack by Hamas in Israel, we're seeing those pressures, and something similar could happen in the US context as well. And the group really focused on this problem of a strategic vortex, which pulls in resources, pulls in leadership attention, pulls in political capital, and really derails the strategic competition agenda. And so in that sense, preventive investment in counterterrorism is actually good for strategic competition. I think we spoke about alliance politics considerations as well. The fact that you know, on the eve of the withdrawal, Washington assured European allies that, look, we'll be able to manage the threat that comes out of Afghanistan. And you know, I think allies will raise questions, should there be violence on their soil. Doesn't mean that, you know, alliance credibility in the traditional sense will come under stress, but certainly it would hurt American reputation. And finally, on the risk of regional security dilemmas, the group spent time thinking about you know, the perils to U.S. interests should Pakistan get more destabilized, or what if there is another attack in India, which leads India to consider military action against Pakistan. We'd be in a very similar situation to what we saw in 2019, and that would most certainly be not welcome, not desirable from an Indo-Pacific strategy perspective as well. And so these are some of the different logics the group considered as to why a continued focus on CT, a calibrated, a judicious focus on CT remains important.
Thank you for that. I want to shift the conversation to what I think is really a very important part of the report, and I commend many of you, all of you, to read it. You know, is how the terror threats have evolved, actually. So again, we do not have a large U.S. military presence there, and things have continued to change. Maybe we aren't as focused, but that doesn't stop these groups from evolving and changing given the reality on the ground. So Asfandyar, I want to ask you if you can talk about some of the key trends in terms of the threat picture that the group identified.
Sure. You know, when we started our work, there was a feeling in the group, I think some members had this assumption that terror threats from the region had been overstated, in particular during the discussion on the withdrawal itself. But then just as we kicked off summer of 2022, the US government located Al-Qaeda leader Ayman al-Zawahiri, you know, smack in the middle of Kabul. And, you know, that was a major challenge to the assumptions of, you know, some members in the group, you know, who thought that perhaps the Taliban would go about their relationships with these terror groups differently. You know, fact that the Taliban would once again bring the leader of Al-Qaeda back to Kabul, you know, after 20 years of war, multiple years, rounds of negotiations, specifically on the Al-Qaeda question. I think that really made us cautious on how we observed the terror landscape. And then, you know, through the course of our deliberations, the TTP mounted a real comeback, resurged, you know, escalated its violence in Pakistan, again with the help, the support of the Taliban. And then ISIS-K, the Taliban appeared to oppose it, fight it, but there was always this question we had whether what they're doing would be sufficient to degrade the external attack ambition capability of that particular group. And as we were concluding our work, you know, there were reports of all these foiled attacks, you know, linked back, traced back to ISIS-K in Europe, and then of course the attack in Iran, Kerman, Iran, earlier in the year, and then in March, the Moscow attack, you know, I think affirmed some of our concerns. So, you know, I think the way we summarize this is that the opportunity environment in Afghanistan and then parts of Pakistan certainly remains very conducive for a lot of these groups. The structural environment is very enabling. ISIS-K as a threat has both the intent and now increasingly appears to have the capability to strike at US interests. TTP, it's the largest group, you know, which has had, which is sort of aimed in different directions, and you know, the intent of that group remains pretty fluid. Al-Qaeda weakened, but still lurking in this region. Most worryingly, it is continuously calling for attacks against US citizens, US military bases, the US homeland. And then finally, we spent time thinking about the anti-India militancy vector, both in Afghanistan and Pakistan. And the assessment there was that it is subdued, most likely because of restraint and restriction by Pakistan. But then the group worried about Al-Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent sort of avowed, declared aims against India. I think the group was really concerned about that.
Thank you for that, Asfandyar. Mike, I want to turn to you. When you were in the military as a uniformed officer. You dealt with ISIS.
I did.
You know, Asfandyar you fought ISIS in Syria and in Iraq. I want to ask you specifically about them. Asfandyar mentioned ISIS-K, variant of ISIS, and the recent attacks we've seen in Kerman, Iran, and then the spectacular attack in Moscow that killed 150 civilians
Yes.
in a concert hall. You know, at the beginning of our deliberations, the ISIS threat was maybe somewhat less clear. But by the end, I mean, these attacks make it very clear. I'd like to ask you from your experience, you know, what makes this group so resistant, so dangerous, but also what makes this region, Afghanistan and Pakistan, so conducive for the group's regional and global agenda?
Thank you. A belief that I formed while I was still on active duty still holds today. I believe the Islamic State is the most capable, most inspirational, most effective terrorist group in modern history. And they are getting better. But why? Why do I attribute these strengths to them? First of all, the fact that they are apocalyptic may strike those of us in the West as being incredibly off-putting and ridiculous. It makes them inspirational. At the risk of telling a very brief story, when we first started grappling with ISIS in Iraq, my senior task force commander was a veteran Navy SEAL who had spent years in combat against Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And I asked him one day, what's the difference between fighting Al-Qaeda in Iraq versus the Islamic State in Iraq? And what he told me has stuck with me ever since. He said, sir, what always impressed me about Al-Qaeda was their willingness to fight us. But what impresses me even more about the Islamic State is their willingness to die. He said they want to die, and that scares the hell out of me. So that apocalyptic character, which Westerners tend to dismiss, is a source of enormous strategic strength for the Islamic State. Secondly, they are pioneers of many things that make them even better. Online recruiting was a thing before ISIS became a reality, but they made it exponentially better. They're still, in my judgment, the best online terrorist recruiters in the world. And they not only pioneered that, they pioneered what we started using as a term of art in the USCT community. Remember inspired attacks? The people that had never met an ISIS operator in their lives in Western Europe and in other places around the world, suddenly, because of something they saw online where an ISIS leader was saying, if you can come to Iraq, if you can come to Syria, you are welcome. But if you cannot, do not worry. Use what you can, use what you have, and kill who you can. That was a directive from the Islamic State. Use what you have and kill who you can. And thousands of people around the world died as a result. Lastly, ISIS has an advantage that I would argue very few other terrorist groups enjoy, and that is they have almost no internal constraints. An act of restraint in the Islamic State is completely antithetical to their way of operating, whereas in Al-Qaeda and other groups, there are internal constraint mechanisms. There are no internal constraint mechanisms in ISIS.
That is quite a scary picture. You know, in Afghanistan, ISIS-K is actually being, the Taliban are actually fighting them. I want to turn to you, Laurel, to talk a little bit about the Taliban. I mean, we now have a Taliban that, you know, is the de facto government in Afghanistan and has been now for several years. Doesn't seem to be going anywhere. But how did the group see the Taliban's policies contributing to or even curtailing terrorist threats? How has the region changed since the Taliban have come to power?
Well, the Taliban have behaved predictably, and not only predictably, but in ways that were predicted by people who had been watching them closely. So, for instance, it might be surprising to people who haven't watched this very closely that the Taliban seems to be demonstrating more loyalty to TTP than to Pakistan. TTP being an anti-Pakistan terrorist group that is friendly with, allied with, cousins of the Afghan Taliban. I don't think I was alone in often believing that Pakistan would, come to rue the day that it supported the Afghan Taliban, because a Taliban victory in Afghanistan was by no means likely to lead the Afghan Taliban to suddenly be puppets of or proxies of Pakistan. So I think that relationship there, giving safe haven to both ideological space and literal space to the TTP, is something that has exacerbated the threat picture in the region. Similarly, in the sense of being predictable, their capabilities to counter ISIS-K are limited. It has to be said, ISIS-K arrived in Afghanistan and gained a foothold while the US and NATO were still there. And the US never seemed to quite reduce the numbers. As many, maybe this speaks to the resilience points, Mike, that you made. So it's not as if this isn't a very difficult and challenging problem. And so to expect the Taliban to be vastly more successful than the United States was in decimating ISIS-K, we have to be realistic about it, even though they are present there. Another predictable element is their continuing relationship with al-Qaeda, the fact that they gave safe haven to Ayman al-Zawahiri, not terribly surprising. Yes, in the negotiations with the United States prior to the withdrawal, they did make so-called counterterrorism assurances, but they were very hedged assurances and limited assurances. They were essentially commitments, if you want to put them that way, to keep a lid on things. Mm-hmm. They were commitments to disallow certain activities, but not, I shouldn't even say disallow, to not allow, which is not quite the same as disallowing certain activities. They never promised to actually counter al-Qaeda. They were, in fact, in the negotiations, highly resistant to even calling al-Qaeda a terrorist group. Mm-hmm. So there were plenty of clues there about the limitations of any kind of assurances that they would make, and I think it was to be expected that they would take action against groups that they saw as a threat to themselves. Mm-hmm. They do not see al-Qaeda as a threat to themselves. They do not see TTP as a threat to themselves, and so they were always going to be very limited in terms of what they would do in order to keep a lid on things. They weren't going to go after these groups. There's also the matter of the ideological space that the Taliban have created in Afghanistan, the changes that they've made to the education system, to the curriculum there. It has to be said, the Taliban won the war. They had a 20-year jihad, and they were successful, and they took power back in Afghanistan. And that is the lesson that is being taught, that political change can come through these, the violence and the resistance and the mechanisms that they pursued. And we have to expect that that's going to infuse how they are educating a next generation, and we have to expect that that's going to create an ideological home for groups that and an inspirational story for groups that that are, have ambitions to be a threat to Western interests and to U.S. interests. I think one of the ways that we looked at this in the study group was, we don't have a lot of leverage over the Taliban. So it's not a question of there being some golden key to unlock what it is to do about this situation that I've just described. But we did consider that there is more that could be done than is being done today to document, draw attention to, expose publicly and among regional countries and allies and partners what it is that the Taliban is doing and not doing. No one has formally recognized the Taliban as the government, but a number of countries have all but formally recognized the Taliban as the legitimate government, accepted their ambassadors in their countries. And there could be a more concerted effort than there is today, and at a higher level of seniority and level of activity to draw attention to what the Taliban is doing and not doing, and try to bring a more uniform degree of pressure on them in the future. It's not going to be perfect, but doing at least more than is being done today seemed to the study group to be warranted.
I want to shift, I think you offer a good segue to shift to the policy options. By the end of our discussions where we ended up, the study group has policy recommendations or options for policymakers. Laurel, I want to ask you, how did the group interpret the current ongoing policy, but also what are the broad frameworks of policy the group recommends for both Afghanistan policy and Pakistan policy? And what is the point of departure from the current policy? I know we're not suggesting huge shifts. This is just almost a titration of the policy. So I welcome your sharing of the options.
Yeah, I think the point of departure, and I referenced this earlier, was that we're not recommending going back to this all-consuming focus on counterterrorism. We are recommending embedding it more in the current policy, and spending relatively more than is being done today in terms of policy attention and resources on the problem, because the threat is growing. Don't be afraid to say the word counterterrorism in the context of South Asia. So it's, in a sense, that's a very simple recommendation. I mean, just pay a somewhat more attention. But it is, we felt, the study group felt a salient one. The current US policy to us appeared to be that the goal that was the goal for 20 years of post 9/11 is the same today. Prevent Afghanistan from being a safe haven from which terrorist attacks on US soil and US interests could be launched. But to do it with very, very minimal resources, very, very minimal resources. And so, we didn't question that as the basic policy goal. Where we thought the space was needed for more deliberation and more focus is how minimal is too minimal? How much is enough in terms of both Afghanistan and Pakistan? And, where is it that is that, I don't want to suggest that you can find that perfect Goldilocks, it's not too hot and it's not too cold, it's just right. I mean, that's a simple thing to say and a hard thing to do, but it is a question of paying a little more attention to finding that calibrated space. For Afghanistan, as I mentioned, there were both diplomatic and military elements to what our recommendations are. Focusing on the diplomatic elements, as I mentioned, our frame was more focus on examining what the Taliban is doing, calling it out publicly, working with regional countries to put more attention and focus on this, because there is shared concern, even as between the US and its adversaries in South Asia and beyond, there is concern about the Taliban's behavior and the growth of the terrorist threat. And so there still is an opportunity for some dialogue and shared approaches, or at least parallel aligned approaches vis-a-vis the Taliban. For Pakistan, our view was, we all appreciated, and many of the people in the study group experienced the frustration and annoyance and feelings of betrayal by some in leadership positions in the US about Pakistan, but at the same time, a clear-eyed view of the situation requires you to consider that geography is geography. Pakistan will forever be next door to Afghanistan. It is now and for the foreseeable future a place of instability and militancy and growing threats, and moreover, Pakistan will forever be next door to India. And so to not think about the dynamics there and that worst case scenario, not only for Pakistan and India, but for the United States of a direct India-Pakistan clash are things that we have to continue to think about. So a stepped up level of counterterrorism cooperation with Pakistan is something that we advocated for in the report, even as against the backdrop of all of the frustrations and challenges that will inevitably face.
Thank you for that. Mike, I want to ask you about the recommendations that the group made, the assessment of the current over-the-horizon posture and the military strategy. Can you talk about how the group identified options to bolster that strategy and the importance of working in terms of the military strategy there?
Thank you. I think that there was pretty broad agreement in our group. It was a subject of some debate, but this is a difficult topic. But I'll elevate this to the level of the U.S. government, since that's what our report fundamentally was trying to address. Over-the-horizon counterterrorism is an important tool, but it's a tactical tool. Over-the-horizon counterterrorism is not a strategy. We have what is undoubtedly the finest, most precise, and in many ways the most abundant ability of any nation on earth to do a precision kinetic strike on something or someone. And that can be very useful in dealing with a terrorist threat. One of the things that I've probably said way too much during our discussions was that it's basically good for two things. Kinetic counterterrorism is basically good for two things. You can either save lives. In other words, if you don't strike somebody who should not die is going to die, or you can just significantly damage whatever it is you're striking. But it never has been, nor will it ever be, a strategic solution for terrorism. It's a tool. It's not a strategy. So then the conversation rather predictably became one, then what else must accompany our exquisite ability to do counterterrorism? And as I'm sure everybody in this room could anticipate, this led us to arenas where it was very clear the more we went to these arenas, the more uncomfortable policymakers that eventually would read our report were going to be. A presence is helpful. Having no one in country is not. But our attitude at the time of the withdrawal was we're leaving, and we're not leaving anybody behind. Another place our discussions took us to was beyond kinetic counterterrorism, there are other forms of counterterrorism. There are ways of contesting recruitment online. There are ways of providing those in the region or in the country that wish to deal with this problem non-military tools, non-military technologies, non-military information that would strengthen their ability to do so and reduce the likelihood that they'll become the subject of reprisal attacks. But again, these things are best done if you have a presence in the country, and of course we went to zero. So at the end of the day, my own view of where we ended up was that there are many things the United States could do, there are many things that other countries in the region in cooperation with us could do to reduce the likelihood of a major terrorist threat against the U.S. or its interests from emerging, but our ability to do so had become so constrained, and as we've already discussed, our attention had so skewed to other things that there were many times in our conversations where we said, well, we could do X, Y, and Z, but we probably won't.
Thank you for that. Asfander, very briefly, I just want to ask you if there are any policy options in
Sure.
our discussion that you would like to highlight.
Sure. So building on what Laurel said about greater exposure to the Taliban's linkages, relationships with terror groups, we propose an annual report on the Taliban's CT compliance. You could think of it almost as a report card on their counterterrorism commitments as part of the Doha Accord, as well as various other commitments they have made in the region. We spent some time thinking through the value of communication channels with the Taliban, and our conclusion was that CT-related channels are pragmatic, with the Taliban, both for conveying concerns and setting expectations on what the international community needs to see against transnationals, as well as regional security threat vectors. On Pakistan, our experts, members of the group, spoke about the importance of establishing a structure of reciprocity, a trade space, on CT exchanges. And here, people drew on the past, specifically U.S.-Pakistan exchanges on Al-Qaeda and the TDP. And the conclusion was that if the USG was to provide CT-specific hardware and assistance like intelligence, which improves Pakistan's, say, defensive or even offensive capabilities, specifically in the CT domain, that would open up the aperture of action, collaboration against ISIS-K. Though our assessment was that Pakistan's own threat assessment of ISIS-K is pretty adverse, so there is common ground there. And then on some of the issues that Mike just touched on the side of military and intelligence options, the group proposes an elevation of CT and AFPAC in the DNI, Director of National Intelligence's National Intelligence Priorities Framework, the NIPF. We also suggest a review of the Presidential Policy Memorandum and the National Security Council Memorandum 13, which these are two documents which outline the broad policy framework for military intelligence authorities for CT. And the general thrust there is to afford more flexibility, not a reversion to the past, just more flexibility than is currently sort of permitted. And then finally, we proposed some stepped up resourcing for CENTCOM on the count of Over the Horizon. CENTCOM Chief General Kurilla has now noted to Congress 2 years in a row that he doesn't have the ISR resources as well as a sufficient number of analysts to even process the information he has, because that has been redirected under the 2022 NDS. So those are some of the specific adjustments that we honed in on in the recommendations section.
Thank you for that. Lastly, I want to just touch on the worst case scenario, and very briefly, as I do want to get to some audience questions, but Mike, if you can just talk about the worst case scenario, how did the group's thinking on pressures that are likely to result from an attack, a terrorist attack, either in the homeland or against U.S. interests, and what is helpful as we think through that context? How do we need to prepare for that?
Well, hopefully it does not happen, but the likelihood that it's going to happen, in my personal opinion, is rising, but we'll see. In terms of where the group ended up, I think we all generally agreed that, and I certainly share this view, that regardless of what our other priorities may be, which are all very important, dealing with Russia, dealing with China, they're all important. But if there is a major catastrophic attack on an American ally, or God forbid, on the U.S. homeland, it will suddenly become priority number one. Everything else will also be priority number one, by the way, but it'll become priority number one. And there'll be a lot of resources and a lot of attention and a lot of pressure to, quote, do something about this. But it'll beg the question, what are we trying to do, and with what, given all our other commitments? And I don't know the answer to any of that, but it'll be a hell of an argument in this town. Right. So that's number one. The United States will be compelled. It will have no choice but to aggressively respond, given the kind of catastrophic nature of the scenario we're talking about here. But for me, this wasn't necessarily a consensus in the group, but for me, a more important question, if we do in fact respond in some major way, is are we going to repeat the mistake that I've already alluded to of thinking that just a massive kinetic reprisal is going to solve the problem? There is absolutely no evidence that it will, but we fall into that trap over and over again. Or will we take a more, actually, I'm going to say it, a more careful and a wiser approach that answers the question, why did this happen in the first place? What was it that led to the fact there could be another major attack on the U.S. interests or on the U.S., and what are we going to do about that beyond just retribution? That's something we're not particularly good at, but I pray that if, God forbid, it does happen, that we actually spend some brain power on that. Otherwise, we're going to have the same results.
Right. Thank you for that, Mike. Laurel, I want to draw you out on specifically, with the Indo-Pacific strategy, we are so focused on our relationship with India. A very likely scenario is a future attack emanating from this region in India. How did the group see that? What are the trade-offs and what are the options for policymakers there?
Yeah, I mean, just briefly, I think the group very strongly appreciated the importance of the India relationship to the United States in many respects. And it's not only about, competition with China. There are a lot of other reasons for growing that relationship. India did not favor a U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan because of concerns not only about the Taliban, but because of terrorism risk concerns for itself. India was long unhappy with the U.S. policy approach in Afghanistan. And afterwards, after the U.S. withdrawal, I think has implemented a fairly savvy policy of trying to build up its own relationships with the Taliban. And I think they pivoted in their policy approach in order to protect their own interests. A key thing to be concerned about if there were an incident is the long divergent approaches between the US and India on attribution of terrorist attacks and other kinds of incidents. And there is a pattern of not being on the same page in terms of attribution methodologies versus assumptions of who's really at fault and what to do about that. And if you're trying to mitigate the risk of conflict between India and Pakistan, questions of attribution become really important. And so one of our recommendations was to attempt to confront that head on as much as you can in a preemptive way by, for instance, engaging in some tabletop exercises or other kinds of exercises between the US and India to explore how would attribution be explored and conducted in the aftermath of an attack. What would the reactions of the two sides be and the methods of the two sides be? I don't want to suggest that that's a perfect approach, but at least having that dialogue with India and perhaps practicing through some exercises with India, if that's not being done, could be helpful to avoid just having to deal with that difficult question in a reactive mode in the aftermath of an incident.
Very interesting. And Asfandir, just to close out our discussion here, what are some of the specific things that policymakers should be doing to prepare themselves to deal with this worst case scenario? Are there specific options that jump out at you?
Sure. So building on Laurel's point on attribution, which is a critical node and decision point in the event of a regional terror attack, but also in case of an attack against a U.S. interest or, again, the worst case, the U.S. homeland, and investing in the United States' own capabilities for precise attribution of a terror attack. This can be done by elevating attribution, again, in the National Intelligence Priorities Framework. Because the variables to optimize in a crisis situation are after terrorists hit our time, information on the incident, and options, granular options, all of which help policymakers calibrate their response, and if they want, take the path of a very careful, measured approach. Another thing, and I think this is one option we have gotten some feedback from policymakers on, is the importance of training for officials on handling of these kinds of crisis situations. We are seeing the imperative of that in the aftermath of the October 7th terror attack by Hamas in the Middle East. And people who deal with South Asia, this part of the world, in the policy community, if they were around for the last crisis, great, they know the pressures. But there's a lot of churn in government, and those who were around but did not experience those pressures, I think there's a lot of value in priming them into those pressures, in helping them think through systematically through simulations among other exercises that helps them prepare on how to handle and deal with such situations.
Thank you for that. We have a few minutes left. I'd love to open up to maybe 2 questions from the audience. If you can just state your name and identify your affiliation. We have some microphones coming by.
Thank you. Thank you so much to the panelists. My name's Kate Bateman. I'm at USIP. My question is about the integration of our diplomacy and political efforts with CT. It seems to me there's now a narrative about the siloed nature of the war and the intervention, and it seems that CT kind of meets the diplomatic effort only at very senior levels of government. I'm wondering if the study group reflected on that dilemma. And there are frictions in timeline, of course, and there's an operational imperative for classification and compartmentalization and so on. But to name one big example, in the immediate wake of 9/11, you had President Bush give the ultimatum to Mullah Omar to hand over Osama bin Laden. There was no robust diplomatic / intel effort to try to persuade Mullah Omar to do that. And in the meantime, we had this rush to war. I think even if we're not contemplating a war or a massive state building effort, I think there may be lessons for other places where we do CT, where we have a real siloed bureaucracy. Could you offer any reflections on that? Thank you.
I'll take a stab at this. The question of interagency coordination, I'll use that term, did periodically come up in our discussions, as I recall. I don't think it was a major theme, but it almost inevitably you have to end up talking about interagency coordination, whether it's good or bad. I'll give you my own view of what the need is now. While I would certainly argue that if I compare what interagency coordination looked like before 9/11 versus what it looks like now, it's a lot better. But it has far further to go than it has currently traveled. I personally am a fan of changing the lexicon to interagency integration, which will make people incredibly nervous and even angry in this town. But we've gotten to the point, if the various elements of the US government, I'm talking about military and civilian, don't find ways to consistently operate together, what will happen is we'll have a failure against terrorism somewhere in the world, and when the report is done about the failure, what the investigators will find is there wasn't enough integration between the various parts of the US government that were trying to solve the problem. It has to be better than coordination. I'm talking about doing things together in ways that will make us very uncomfortable.
Can I add
Please,
one thing?
please.
During the time that I was involved with Afghanistan policy in the government, I saw the issues as less a question of siloing and more a matter of whose bureaucratic voice mattered in the decision making. And in the context in which the US was militarily engaged in Afghanistan, the military and intelligence voices just dominated, even though I think our group recognized that terrorism and counterterrorism is a political military issue. The Taliban had a political military strategy. The US didn't always have a political military strategy. But that wasn't because of siloing per se. It was more a matter of where is the weight of authority when you're in that kind of decision-making context. And it's way, way on the military and intelligence side. I do think, just as a kind of, this maybe goes to the training point a little bit, more opportunity, even if you're short of integration, for experience exchanges.
Yep.
I mean, I remember
We
one
called it
time.
exchanging hostages.
Oh, I referred to it when I would go visit with, military groups, and I don't even know the right language. I refer to it as a sort of, I was on a cultural exchange program. Like everything about their meetings, their style, like everything was different. But it was hugely valuable. And I do think there was actually relatively more opportunity during that period of time for people from the diplomatic, civilian, political space to be interacting with military and intelligence colleagues than in your ordinary course of business in Washington. And there was some cross-learning in that way, but more of that is better. And when I was working at the State Department, we had some military detailees into our office, and they felt like they were on a cultural exchange program too. And sometimes I think almost felt like they were tainted by having, experienced these, gone native in certain ways.
Right.
So, but more of that would be better.
Yeah, definitely. Maybe we have time for one here, and then the last one there. Okay.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm Geeta Bakshi, former CIA CT officer and currently at the Afghan War Commission. Just a quick question for the panel. How did you view, or how maybe should we be viewing the Haqqani network within this CT discussion? We know historically the Haqqani network has had strong ties with AQ. In fact, even looking at the Zawahiri operation, my understanding is there was a strong Haqqani connection there as well. What are your guys' thoughts on the Haqqani network within our CT discussion?
Thank you. I'm going to turn to Mike.
This is one of my
'cause
favorite
is his
topics.
favorite topic, yes.
Flashbacks, so many. In my view, the Haqqani network has several important attributes. Number one, I personally think they are the most successful terrorist group in modern history. That doesn't necessarily mean they're the most powerful, but they're the most successful. Their network of not just regional, but international relationships that they very deliberately, patiently, and effectively cultivate make them almost invulnerable because they have so many friends and allies around the world. It might not actually be possible to destroy them at this point, or it would require a hell of an effort. Secondly, the fact that they have this enormous network of effective relationships gives them the ability to do things that I would argue most terrorist groups cannot do. Now, the good news is I'm not aware of any global takeover ambitions the Haqqani network has. They are comparatively modest in their aspirations compared to organizations like Al-Qaeda and ISIS, but in many ways that actually makes them even more dangerous because they stay below the radar screen and they get away with murder.
They're playing the long game.
Yes.
I mean, just to add,
Please.
I mean, there have been so many debates over
Yes.
the last 20 plus years about what is the Haqqani network, and reflecting on the fact that that's actually a term that the U.S. made up. I mean, the Haqqanis don't call themselves the Haqqani network. I mean, they are a clan, a family, a group. They are part of the Taliban. They are a number of overlapping things. They are a political military entity, political military economic entity, and that's part of their resilience, and they are part of the fabric of rule in Afghanistan now. So it's difficult to think of them in a purely terrorist group sense, and certainly to try to analogized to a transnational terrorist group like ISIS and Al-Qaeda is problematic. But I do think they're a context-specific threat when you're thinking about the U.S. They were a context-specific threat when we were in Afghanistan because they opposed our presence in Afghanistan. That doesn't make them, I'm not saying that there aren't issues with the Afghanis, I'm just saying in the context of talking about what are the threats to the U.S., it doesn't mean that they're a threat to the U.S. presently emanating from Afghanistan.
Did you want to comment?
I'll just add that I hope you'll read the report. We have done a tiering of threats. And so the tier 1 threats we identify as transnationals. The tier 2 are not regional, but in fact, these threshold threats. Groups that may otherwise appear to be not directly threatening, but parts of those groups and entities may play a role in assisting the tier 1 threats, and Haqqanis are certainly a part of that category. So that's how we ended up sort of approaching and prioritizing the level of focus, attention, resources that ought to be devoted to elements in the Haqqani clan.
And I would just, the emotion part of it is very deep on the Haqqani, so we have to be eyes wide open. I'm going to take one.
The American emotion.
Yes, the American emotion. Sorry, the American emotion. We have one last question in the back, actually. She's been waiting, so thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Just a note on Daesh and ISIS in Afghanistan, that was a brand used interchangeably oftentimes in the past 10 years or so. Many of Taliban's disgruntled commanders and fighters joined Daesh in 2015 and in the years following that. Both groups have similar militant tactics, including willing to die for their leaders and for their leaders' ideology. The Taliban's rule on extremist ideology, establishment of jihadi madrasas. I didn't hear a lot of comments on the jihadi madrasas and the madrasification of the school system in Afghanistan, in my view, provide an environment conducive for growth and expansion of transnational terrorist groups. Now the question is, knowing what we know, what could the US do about it? Should we just wait and strike when, unfortunately, there is another attack? Or there are things that we can do right now to prevent that from happening, not only in the US, but also in other parts of the world? Thank you.
So maybe, Laurel, I'll turn to you specifically on Taliban. Are there options now that we should be doing? I think the question is
To modify the
Taliban
behavior.
Yeah.
Look, 20 years of fighting them didn't modify their behavior. That's how big the challenge is. And a logical takeaway from the American war in Afghanistan for the Taliban is that if you're stubbornly consistent and persistent, your objectives will prevail. And so to suggest that there's some kind of, with the US being out of Afghanistan, having limited capabilities to take any actions in Afghanistan, limited influence, nothing really plausibly on offer for the Taliban to try to persuade them, not that they're easily persuadable. And with the set of relationships that the US has in the region, the options are limited. I don't think that they're, I think the reason we focused specifically on calling out their behaviors related to creating an environment that is conducive for the growth of this terrorist threat is specifically to try to rally others, especially within the region, who might have more influence than the US. But the fact is, invading Afghanistan and spending 20 years there did not change the minds and behaviors of the Taliban. And so to suggest that there's something now that we can do better with so much less than that is, I think, just implausible. Sorry to say.
On that point, I think we've reached the
Oh,
end of
dear.
our time.
Yeah, to end on,
Yes,
yeah.
it is. I think it demonstrates how hard this problem is, how difficult it is to actually pay attention to these problem sets and the evolving nature of them. I do want to thank you all for joining us today. I commend you to the report. There's a lot more to discuss. There's a lot more to think about, and I want you to join me in thanking my panelists and all the study group members for their time.